Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bonnie Weddle. I am the coordinator of the Electronic Records Unit at the New York State Archives, and I am co-chair of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which focuses, as the screen says, on web archiving in times of rapid change. Today's webinar is part of SERI's Fall 2020 slate of webinars. Next month's webinar is going to focus on digital preservation self-assessments and how to make them work for you. We also have a Spring 2021 series of webinars that will begin in January. We have them planned out actually through March, or actually through April, I believe, and the publicity materials will be going up on the COSA website shortly. And now for the matter at hand, web archiving in very interesting times. And before I turn the floor over to them, I'm going to introduce our presenters. Rachel Smith is a collections archivist at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. Before joining the Alabama Department of Archives and History in 2015, she worked at the Tennessee State Library and Archives. Jamie Patrick Burns is the digital archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina, where she's responsible for the day-to-day operations and maintenance of the repository of born digital and digitized records. Morgan Jones King is a certified archivist and has served the South Carolina Department of Archives and History as the Electronic Records Archivist for 3.5 years. Before that, she worked with the South Carolina State Historic Preservation Office to digitize and make archival material available through an online database, the South Carolina Historic Properties Record. And last but by no means least, Elizabeth Perkes is the Electronic Records Archivist at the Utah State Archives, where she has worked for the last 30 years. She also manages Utah's Axiom system and contributes to the division's website. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Rachel.
That wonderful introduction, Bonnie. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rachel Smith, a collections archivist at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. The ADAH has been web archiving since 2005 when we became an Archivit partner. We have captured 7.6 terabytes of content over the last 15 years. We currently use Archivit to capture our state agency websites and social media content. We do not use our account to crawl any local government or private sites. For the FY20 fiscal year, we had a 1 terabyte subscription amount. To maximize that data limit throughout the year, I crawl our website collections twice a year and our social media sites 4 times a year. While this is a pretty set schedule, I can also do some additional targeted patch crawls. I have done these before when they have been requested by my colleagues or a state agency or during a specific event, like our governor's resignation in 2017. About a week after we started working from home in mid-March, our collections and appraisal records management staff started discussing how to approach documenting COVID-19. Web crawling was a key part of that initiative. We initially identified 16 agencies we should target that we felt would be the most involved in our state's response to the pandemic. These included our constitutional officers, Department of Public Health, Education, Labor, Emergency Management, medical licensing boards, and a few others. I ran patch crawls and Archivit for these agencies' websites and their Twitter accounts for an initial capture in March and again in September. We also added a few other agencies to this list in April. This was very similar to the targeted patch crawls I have performed in the past, though on a larger scale. But we started to notice more web content that we wanted to capture. Like most states, I am assuming, our Department of Public Health launched a data tracking site to report case numbers, testing locations, demographics, etc. My colleague, Charles Johnson, wrote some scripts so we could start harvesting web content to our own servers more frequently and effectively. He used the wget and Puppeteer tools with his scripts to create the works and screenshots. He started with sites from state public health authorities with frequently updated CSV formatted data tables so we could document how the rapidly updated information appeared over time. He also captured other state agency sites that we had not included in our targeted patch crawls and Archivit. Slowly, we grew our crawls to include websites beyond our state agency creators since we wanted to get a wider perspective on pandemic response across the state. Charles started crawling COVID-19 specific pages from local governments, colleges and universities, hospitals, nonprofit organizations, and chambers of commerce. We spread our web crawler net far and wide to capture how various types of institutions were changing their operations during this time. The frequency of these crawls varies, with some sites being captured every 6 hours and some once a week. As you can imagine, this has dramatically increased our amount of web content. This COVID-19 response collection is currently 1.5 terabytes and growing every day. Of course, we faced some challenges during this project. Initially, we were working within our archive it limitations. We did want to use up all of the data in our subscription, and the snapshot nature of those crawls was not the most effective for the data tables on the sites we wanted to capture. Starting our own web crawling system helped us work outside those concerns. We were also trying to stay on top of all of the new websites or subsites that kept being created for the pandemic response. Our staff was monitoring the news for any new links that we needed to be added to our list, or just flagging any changes that we found. For a while, it seemed that every day they added a new data table to the Department of Public Health Tracker site. So we would notify Charles about the change and he would alter our captures. Basically, just constant vigilance as best we could. We do have the problem that only one staff member currently understands the tech behind our new web crawling script system, and that is not me. I always joke that whenever Charles talks about writing a new script, this cat is how I picture him, just typing away and making it happen. He is very patient to explain his work, but we still have a long way to go before we have cross-trained on this new system to share our institutional knowledge. We also need to think about the sustainability of this project. When we started crawling this new vast number of sites, we thought it would be for a few months. As the pandemic continues and we continue to crawl, we will need to start making some appraisal decisions about what we should maintain for the long term. I also do want to acknowledge that all of this work was happening while staff was handling the transition to work from home and finding their, quote, new normal of living through these unprecedented times. So many kudos to my colleagues for taking on this project within this context. This experience has greatly changed our web crawling practices. Previously, we were only using ArchiveIt. We now have our own internal system that is more responsive that we can use to supplement our subscription. We will have to consider how we will provide access to this new content. The benefit of ArchiveIt is that it is easily accessible through the Internet Archive, while our new crawls currently only live on our servers. We are now capturing sites created by non-state agencies, including local governments, educational institutions, and private organizations. We also have used this system to capture web content private individuals have wanted to donate, which can be useful in the future as we have more of those donations. This project also has made us more proactive in seeking out sites to crawl. Previously, we would typically add seeds to our ArchiveIt crawls based on state agency requests. Now we are looking out for new sites to start crawling immediately. Since we are not using ArchiveIt for these sites, we are not using up our data subscription and committing to maintaining them. This has given us more freedom to capture more now and probably weed later. This project has also increased staff collaboration with web archiving. The appraisal and collection sections are working together in new ways to grow our web collections. Thanks so much for letting me share about what we've been doing here at ADAH. I can't wait to hear from my fellow panelists about their experiences. Here's my contact information. I've also included Charles' info in case you have any technical questions. He's more than willing to explain our scripts and our system. Feel free to reach out. And thanks, and I pass it on to Jamie.
All right. Thank you, Rachel. I think we're going to find a lot of similarities across our experiences. So I'm the digital archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina. And a bit of background on our web archiving program. We have also been a partner with ArchiveIt since 2005. We partner with the State Library of North Carolina on a lot of our digital preservation programs, including web archiving. So we have a team of 7 people at the moment that's half archives, half state library, to do the crawls and the quality control and maintenance of our web archiving. We also use Archive Social for selected media sites, or social media sites, but we haven't changed any of our practices with that as a response to the pandemic. So today I'm just going to be talking about Archive It. We have a 3 terabyte subscription per year at this point, and we have 26 terabytes approximately of data collected through Archive It. We crawl around 600 URLs actively, and we do crawls every 2 months for most websites and social media pages, and boards and commissions we crawl once a year because those don't change as often. And then, as Rachel said, occasionally we'll have a one-time crawl or a special circumstances crawl, like at the end of an election year, things like that. So that's kind of our the background of what we do under normal circumstances. In late March and early April, as the pandemic began and people started working from home, our government records section and digital services started talking together about what we needed to capture related to COVID-19. And they coordinated with our records analysts and appraisal archivists to identify any websites that had particular information that we needed to be sure that we were capturing. And so from that, the records analysis unit identified 82 URLs of unique COVID-related data and produced a list of the URLs and a short description and which agency they came from. And then our web archiving group divided up that list to check and see, make sure that they were being archived and add anything that wasn't. The good news was that a lot of those sites were being captured. Either they were subpages or already some main pages that we were archiving, but about 20 of them were new. So we added in the new ones and did a special quality control. We do review each seed, but since we have so many, it's more of an MPLP approach generally. But we did some extra item level quality control for these COVID-19 related seeds. And I'm sure this is the case with many of you, but a lot of sites, ended up just linking to the Department of Health and Human Services, which was fortunate for us that we didn't have to, make sure every single unique page was being captured, because most of them just pointed to DHHS. As I said, a lot of them were already being crawled, and we decided to do monthly captures for the pandemic-related seeds. Obviously web pages are being updated much more frequently, especially with DHHS. But given our data budget, we thought that a monthly crawl of those particular seeds, in addition to our bi-monthly crawls, was a good kind of compromise. We did a special one-time crawl for the boards and commissions site, and we're making sure that we add those COVID-related seeds into our quality control procedures. And at the time that I made these slides, we had around 461 gigabytes of COVID-related data, which obviously will continue to grow. So similar to Rachel, we initially thought this would not be as long-term of a thing as it has ended up to be. So there were a couple times over the summer where we met together as the web archiving group and consulted with government records, and reevaluated is the monthly extra crawls a good idea, and we've continued doing it. We will continue to do it through the end of the year, at which point we'll check in again and see if we'll keep doing those multi-crawls. So we're kind of in it for the long haul. And kind of lessons learned, we have a long, good relationship of collaboration with the web archiving group between the state library and state archives, with records analysis, with state agencies. But this was kind of a special project where we were rushing to make it happen very quickly, and I thought that it went really well. So I appreciated the collaboration of my team members. And it was also good timing. The records analysis unit had put out some blog posts, and we're talking with state agencies specifically regarding their COVID-19 related records. And so it was already on everybody's radar, and it kind of fit in well with a particular format of records that needed to be evaluated and archived. So I did not put my contact information on here, but it is on the State Archives of North Carolina's website, and I am very happy to answer any questions or talk further about our web archiving program. And with that, I will pass it on. I don't remember who is next. I'm sorry. Oh, my contact information is there. Never mind. All right, thank you for adding that in.
Yeah, I added that in, and before we transition over to Morgan, I just wanted to say if anybody has any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat box. We do have one question that's already been entered, and we will address them after all of the presentations are done. Thank you. And we're just waiting for the transition of the slides to go over to Morgan. Okay, Morgan, I think you have control now.
Morgan? Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Whew. I don't know what happened. All right. Well, I apologize for that little blip in technology. I'm not sure what occurred. But thank you, and I really enjoyed hearing what North Carolina and Alabama had to pass on, and so I'll preface this by saying I am just speaking as a representative for our agency because until recently we had another staff member who was doing our web archiving services. So I will just be covering what has happened as a representative. So I'll just give a little bit of background on our web archiving practices. We have been working with Archivist since 2007. We have a smaller data budget than the states that have already presented. We do 512 gigabytes a year, and we've actually already crawled 116 since July, and I suspect a lot of that is to do because of our upped crawls for COVID. We have 4 collections here at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, South Carolina redistricting websites, South Carolina state government cabinet agencies and miscellaneous sites, South Carolina state government agencies, and A through L, and government agencies M through Z. And the crawls are done on a weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, or annual basis. depending on our judgment of the site and how often it changes. Due to our space constraints, we crawl state agencies A through L January through June, and then we flip and crawl state agencies N through Z July through December. Cabinet agencies are crawled year-round. The redistricting websites are no longer crawled, so those are stagnant collection now. We maintain a list of all our crawls on our network so that we can review them and with regularity. I will also say that our websites are not scheduled as part of our records retention schedules, but they are covered under the Public Records Act, and we also stress that just because we're crawling agency websites, it does not mean the agencies do not need to send us documents that may be posted on those websites. All right, so adjusting for COVID, like Rachel and Jamie already mentioned, we sort of started to think about these things in March, and I distinctly remember March came around and we were working from home, and we started to realize that there might be information out there that we were not capturing. And so I emailed our staff member, the electronic records processing archivist at the time, Catherine Slover, who is in charge of maintaining our archivist subscription, to ask her what we were doing in terms of increasing crawls for COVID. And at that point, then, we do not have a web archiving task force or focus group in our agency, but she got together over email a few different folks from our agency, from records management and from processing and from digital services, so that we could do a quick survey of which sites were changing the most frequently and which we would need to up our response to. So we increased crawls for the governor's website, our Department of Health and Environmental Control, Emergency Management Division. I believe we also did Department of Health and Human Services, as well as have a list. Let's see. Department of Education and Department of Commerce. So these were all the ones that got thrown into the ring, and then we went through, and like Jamie mentioned, we found quite a few sites that were actually repeating information and linking to, instead of our DHHS, it was our Department of Health and Environmental Control. So we didn't need to include those sites on our up-to-crawl list, because the only information that was being updated regarding COVID was also on the DHEC website, and it was just being linked to that. So we decided to save ourselves some data and focus on that site. We also added, like other states, South Carolina created a website, you can see here, Accelerate SC, that was specifically about our state's COVID response, so we added that crawl during the time. I will say our electronic records processing archivist also took the opportunity, as we were changing so much about our crawls and reevaluating certain decisions and adding new crawls, to update our metadata standards for our archivist subscription, and that was also very helpful during this time. So making it work, one of the things that really made this very useful is that we worked across our divisions within the agency to make sure staff were engaged. We spoke with records management staff, folks in appraisal and processing, and the digital team staff members, so that we could get everyone's assistance in making sure all sites, all relevant sites, were being taken into account. It's been helpful because I'm not sure how many other folks have this issue, but we don't have one staff person whose entire job is web archiving. It falls under another staff person's already busy job, and so we want to make sure that everyone has a say in making sure that the right sites are being crawled before we push forward. And so that's been very, very useful. And it's also helped make sure that whoever is doing web archiving, like I said, our staff member that was doing it is no longer doing it, and I'm currently monitoring it. It's a good way to make sure that nothing is falling through the cracks. So monitoring the situation, like others, we're going to have to keep an eye on our subscription limits. Because we do flip our crawls because of space restraints. For example, our Department of Health and Environmental Control is being crawled on a weekly basis. So that will defy our normal routine of crawling A through L through June and then switching to M through Z, because that is continuing to be crawled. So we're going to have to keep an eye on our subscription limits because we are certainly crawling things much more frequently. We're also going to have to keep an eye on whether or not there are more new sites. And then we're going to have to keep an eye as things develop. You know, we already heard that this is our new normal. This is not something that's gone away in a few months like perhaps many of us thought it would. But at some point we will need to keep an eye out on when sites stop being updated and when we need to remove those from our crawls because of our subscription limits. And then, like I said, the changes to normal procedures. Our normal schedule has been disrupted for crawls, and so we need to keep an eye on it to make sure the crawls we normally would engage in are being done while we're focusing on special circumstances. So outcomes and lessons for the future. Like I said, we have to watch our limits. You know, we have to be a little more aware. We don't use our Archivit subscription to crawl social media, so that's part of why ours is possibly a little bit lower, but it is filling up awfully fast, and we need to be aware of that. We do have some history, like Jamie and Rachel said, of upping crawls during times of interest. So during election cycles on the governor's page, we might up crawls on that site. And part of this then leads to documentation. And I was recently told by a colleague that that they saw in a webinar that documentation is a love letter written to our future selves. And I thought that was quite delightful. And that's true of this as well. We do have a web archiving manual that staff have kept up with, and part of what needs to go in our web archiving manual is when do we increase crawls, what are the circumstances, because we want to make sure that we hit the ground running when something's happening. And then, of course, continued engagement with staff. Because we don't have a web archiving group, it would be very easy for folks in the digital section to just take over with web archiving and not consult anyone else. And we don't want to silo ourselves or our coworkers in that manner, and we want to make sure that everyone has a voice at the table, especially with something like this where appraisal and processing and digital preservation decisions are all being made a little more back-to-back than would traditionally be the case. And so we need to keep everyone engaged, and that has been one of the lessons, I think, of our upping our crawls during COVID. And there's my contact information. I will do my best to answer any questions anyone might have, or I may refer you to someone within our agency who would be better suited to answer that question. But either way, I will do my best. And I think that's it for me, and I will pass it on to, or I'll ask Becky to pass it on to Elizabeth.
Let's see if I can get my slide in here. All right, I'm from the Utah State Archives. I work with our electronic records, Born Digital. I also do some other things, including working with the Archivit system. In Utah, we've been working with Archivit as a shared service with our state library since about 2007, but we didn't take it over fully until 2018. We have a subscription of about 1.25 terabytes, and my habit has been to harvest all of our agency websites in annually every year. So at the start of the year, I went through my normal course of finding the URLs and changes and harvesting both state and local government websites in January and February. Of course, that was before COVID started. And then once COVID was part of the news, all of a sudden I realized that my test harvests are sort of important because they were capturing the moment in time just before COVID hit. And so there was data there that probably would disappear once the pandemic became more part of the news. And so instead of ditching the test harvest like it was my plan, after I went in and checked the Wayback Machine to see if they were being harvested correctly and make any corrections and so forth, I decided that I needed to keep all of those test harvests, which made our subscription fill up fairly quickly. So it makes it difficult to do a lot more harvesting throughout the year. Then I decided that was important to keep the test harvests. In March, I did a real harvest again for all the municipalities once because that was part of the correction that I had been doing in the early harvest with the tests. And so I went through and fixed all the municipality links and then did a real harvest for that. And then that's kind of when COVID hit. And then the new website started up called coronavirus.utah.gov, and we decided to harvest that one weekly. This was a website run by our state health department, and it had a lot of good data in it, and we felt that that one website would capture 99% of what we needed to capture for the state's response. And then on March 18th, the Salt Lake County experienced an earthquake. It was 5.7. And it was big enough that it damaged a whole bunch of buildings. There were like millions of dollars of damage, and it closed some school buildings and a few other places. So all of a sudden we had two emergencies that we needed to harvest data from. So in June, we decided that would be a good moment in time to capture as many changes related to COVID and related to the earthquake as we could. And so I ran a harvest just on state agencies for all of their content in June, and also Salt Lake County, where the earthquake was centered, so that we could capture whatever data they happened to know about that was on their websites. I had some problems getting information from schools and school districts about the earthquake and the impact that it had. As I went to those web pages, I found that district websites would mention earthquake policies as in what they would do in case an earthquake happened, but they didn't have a lot of content as to what they actually did when the earthquake did happen to them. There were some blog sites on individual school districts where they did mention it. The best source of information that I ended up getting for schools was a newspaper article where it listed every single school that was impacted, and so then I knew which school I needed to go harvest websites from. So at least those specific schools I was able to capture and find information. And deep in those websites, I did find information about this specific earthquake. There was one school where their building was condemned, and it was really hard to find what they had said about it because the school itself just moved to a new building. And so they completely ignored that their old building was damaged beyond control. In June, I also noticed from the Wayback Machine that the coronavirus.utah.gov website was being harvested by everybody, as in 400 people a day would go in and harvest that website. And so we decided not to use that website to take up more of our subscription space, except in very select circumstances. So now that we're left with just a little bit of space left in our subscription, we have to be very judicious into what we harvest. In October, I decided to harvest the Salt Lake County Health Department because it was getting increasingly more information that was useful on that website. And also I heard about state purchasing having a website where they identified very clearly what all the work that they had done with regard to COVID and all the purchases and the money spent and the specific items that they spent, where it came from, and all of that. And they have a very beautiful dashboard on their website where it has graphs and things to let you know where the data is coming from and be able to drill down and and see it. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to harvest. So this is what the website looks like. And if you scroll down this page, it has lots of lovely tables and charts and all of that. But when I looked at the Wayback Machine, this is what it comes back from in Archive It. It has difficulty finding the embedded content. And even when I went specifically to the Tableau source, where that's where the charts came from, Archive It still had difficulty capturing it. It didn't have the data at all. So this is kind of where we're at right now, trying to figure out which websites to capture with COVID and how to get them. And if we capture the purchasing state site by hand, then it won't be captured in the same place where the other state websites are captured. And so how do you provide access easily so people can get to it if I just have screenshots? So lots of questions related to that. I am planning on running harvests on our governor's website just because we've had an election and there is going to be a change in administration. And then after that, I think we'll just have to wait for January again to do a full slate of all of our state and local government agency websites. So that's our plan for right now. If you have any questions about how we're doing this, welcome to contact me.
For questions, I'm sorry, my mic seems to have blanked out there for a moment. We wanted to be sure to leave a lot of time for questions, and we do have one question already here in the chat box. Katie would like to know if any of you have any tips on crawling ArcGIS sites. Her state's Department of Health and Social Services is using ArcGIS to present COVID-19 data, and Archive It doesn't seem to interact with it very well. Has anyone else had experience capturing ArcGIS?
In Utah, we just recently purchased an ArcGIS license online to publish a story map, and I have not tried crawling that one yet, but that is a good idea to see how well it's able to do that.
Encountered that yet in Alabama, so I don't know.
Unfortunately, I don't really have any tips, just that we also have issues. Let's see, I think our, what is it called, NC1 map has, you know, the periodic GIS data crawls, I think they update it every 6 months or something like that. So anyway, so we get their GIS data separately, but as far as the website, we have also had issues with it loading. You know, I've submitted tickets to Archive It, and they've suggested Browser is their like newer crawling technology that's supposed to be better with dynamic pages. I still haven't had success with it, so you know, I think, and I recently had a conversation with records and analysis and description, and Courtney is here in the webinar. She was in that conversation, but about a similar, you know, dashboard with very dynamic data generation, and I think for that we're focusing on capturing the data itself separately from the web presentation. So yeah, unfortunately it might just be other routes to collecting that data that are not web crawls.
We're similar to Jamie. We receive GIS information. We accession it separately. We haven't successfully crawled a ArcGIS website, but we do accession GIS data on its own.
Okay, if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat box. You can access the chat box via the button at the lower right-hand side of your screen. Just as a follow-up, Katie indicated that there are data-driven pages that her repository has captured rendered images of the web pages to make sure that the data is preserved. So Katie, thank you for that suggestion. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I do have one. All four of our presenters today use Archive-It. New York is also an Archive-It shop. Is anyone else using something other than Archive-It to capture data? Rachel mentioned that Alabama now has this kind of homegrown script-based system. I see here in the comments that another state is using a mix of Content DM, Archive-It, and Islandora to harvest Born Digital state agency documents. I know it's possible to use Preservica to capture web content and to make it accessible via the Universal Access Module. Is there anyone out there who's using something other than Archive-It to capture web content? And Charlie from, I believe, Washington has indicated that they have multiple homegrown systems that they're not crazy about. And Washington also had basically a fancy wget system. Wget is an open source web crawling software package, and trying to do something a little more modern these days. Someone else is using Instaloader, which is a Python application for capturing Instagram content. And there's a question from Janine. For those folks using internal systems, how do you make page content accessible?
For me, I think. So since we just started this internal system in March, we are still exploring how we are going to make it accessible. We have talked about possibly uploading the works to Preservica and providing access that way. We also, Charles has built kind of a front page site that you can see the captures for that we have been using internally, which could possibly be used by our patrons. We haven't made those decisions yet, but it is very important that we'll have to think about exactly how to provide access. I think right now we're focusing on capturing, and soon we're going to be talking about probably weeding and then providing access.
Okay.
And upload work files to Archive-It as well, but don't quote me on that because I haven't actually tried that. But I think there was one site that we were having trouble with separately, and I was trying using Web Recorder to get work files, and then I believe there's a way that you can upload it to Archive-It.
That sounds familiar to me as well. I just wasn't sure if those would go against your subscription data amount or not. Yeah. It would be great to provide access all in one place, but we have to ask if that goes against your allotment.
It shouldn't. I say this because New York, until 2017, used OCLC's Web Harvester for crawling, and we've since moved all of our old Web Harvester crawls into Archive-It. It didn't count against our data budget. There were some technical issues. There were some differences in the metadata between OCLC and Archive-It that took a little actually a lot of time and effort to hammer out, but our older crawls, and there's over a terabyte of them, are now accessible via Archive It. So it should be possible to work with Archive It, and if you're using wget or HTT track or some other sort of application to capture web content, to move those work files into Archive It.
That's really good to know. Thank you, Bonnie.
Any other questions? Oh, and Stephen from Connecticut is saying that they use their online catalog is the main point of access for both their electronic and paper-based documents.
I have a question, if that's okay,
Sure.
for Elizabeth. So you mentioned that a lot of other people were harvesting the coronavirus.utah.gov. I'm curious, how did you go about finding out who was harvesting it? And is it like being harvested through, what am I blanking on? It's like, Archive It, but if you don't have a subscription, you can still submit a URL to be harvested. And what do you do with, like we accession our web archiving data. And so are you accessioning data that other people have crawled, that kind of thing?
I just noticed on the harvesting calendar that Archive It produces that it was getting hit a lot from harvests. I could, go to that website and see how many harvests there were, and it was just exploding all over everywhere.
Okay. Are there any other questions for our panelists? While we're waiting for them to come in, I do have a question for our attendees. Are other folks out there altering their web capture schedules in response to the pandemic? And if so, could you tell us just a little bit about that? We do have another question from Charlie. I appreciated Morgan's point about making sure agencies are still preserving and sending in their documents even when those documents are part of your web archiving. Has anyone had any challenges or successes communicating that idea to agencies?
This is Morgan. I will say I think that's probably always a little bit of a challenge, and I can't really speak to that. I would have to refer you to our records management analyst, our electronic records analyst, Jessica Hills. But that is kind of a struggle, I believe, from what I understand, that we have agencies who say, oh, well, you're capturing it, we don't need to send it to you. So we do have to constantly remind them. And that usually comes up at annual records training.
Agree with that point in Alabama. I will say I think our messaging before, when we started doing web archiving, was to agencies that we would be capturing them. In the last few years since I've been here, we have obviously changed that messaging and been encouraging that, if you put your reports on your website, if you put your minutes on your website, any kind of that content that is permanent material, that it still will need to be transmitted. Our appraisal records management team has been written some guidance about that, and they do hammer it home in our training. And I think the messaging has shifted, and so people are starting to understand that it won't be completely crawled.
I will add to that ours, when we crawl an agency's website, it's not like we contact them on a regular basis and remind them. So what we're actually reminding them of on a regular basis is that they need to transfer electronic records to us. We try not to we keep them aware that we're crawling their website, but we don't make a huge deal out of it. We make a huge deal out of them needing to send us their documents.
Same, Morgan. Also, we kind of emphasize that while we are crawling their sites, that Archive It is very, limited, so that even though we are capturing their website, it's not guaranteed we'll capture everything. So it's more important to transmit.
Same.
Yes, I think that's an absolutely essential point, given that web crawling is it's always playing catch up with site design. We have an agency here in New York that puts certain types of electronic copies of certain types of records online. We've captured them for 14 years. A couple months ago, they launched this brand new website with some design features that render all of those reports uncapturable.
Yes, we do have to reach out to agencies occasionally and remind them to to remove blockers or to give us special access to make sure that we can crawl. That's another challenge.
Okay. Any other questions, comments? Anyone else altering their crawling schedules in response to the pandemic or to an earthquake or to, other pleasant things that 2020 has brought our way? Give folks just another minute or so to ask any questions or supply any comments. But I would like to thank all of our panelists. I know I've learned a lot today, and I have some things that I'm going to take back to a couple of my colleagues and discuss. Okay, I'm not seeing anything in the chat box. So I'd just like to thank all of you for attending and encourage you to stay connected to and informed about what COSA is doing. You can do that via the COSA website. COSA is also active on Twitter. Our handle is State Archivist. And COSA maintains a very active Facebook page as well. Finally, when you close out of this webinar, a short evaluation form will appear on your screen. Please take a moment to complete the evaluation. They don't just get, chucked into the wilds of cyberspace where they're abandoned. The SERI Education and Programming Subcommittee really does read your evaluations, and we use them to help plan future offerings. So please complete that survey. We really like seeing your input, and we take it very seriously. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone again and hope you all have a lovely morning or lovely afternoon, as the case may be, and hope to see you back in December for our webinar focusing on digital preservation assessments. Take care, everyone.